Welcome to Think Out, the monthly debate series of the Institute of Science and Technology of Humanity at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. At the Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity, we address societal challenges through transdisciplinary team research, combining the latest in science and engineering with deep domain knowledge from social sciences, humanities, business, and the arts. In each Think Out, two of our institute's leading researchers, both from different disciplinary backgrounds, will debate an important question that the world is facing today. In a Think Out, we aim to dive deep into a complex issue, have fun, and engage you, the audience, in this friendly battle between leading thinkers. Today, we address the question on how should we best respond to the problem of a warming planet. My name is Vanessa Evers, and together with my colleague Helen Stevens, we will moderate this debate. So over to you, Helen, to introduce the research fellows for today's debate.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Welcome, everyone. Before I introduce the speakers for today, the debaters for today, I wanted to introduce the poll question. So we do a poll question at the start and end of every debate. And if we could, okay, so hopefully you can see that that's popped up right now. And the poll, the kind of provocative statement that we've got for you today is, it's already too late to address climate change. So our efforts should be focused on adapting to a warmer world. So if you can just have a think about that, and we're going to put it up at the end again. So let me introduce the two guests that we have for you today. First is Sunny Rosenthal. Sunny is a professor at the Kim Wee School for Communication and Information. He earned his PhD in advertising from the University of Texas at Austin and his MA in communications from Washington State University. His research explores several domains, including science communication, environmental psychology, online learning, communications research methodology. He's primarily interested in studying communication processes in environmental sustainability, with specific interests in climate change, energy conservation, and recycling. So obviously relevant to what we're going to talk about today. And his latest projects include a range of environmental related studies, especially in Singapore, including reducing litter through group competition, energy saving behavioral changes for building occupants in the tropics, and using social comparison to promote energy and water efficiency in Singapore. And he's published widely on these topics. I'd also this time like to introduce Pareen Hamel. Pareen is a Nanyang Assistant Professor at the Asian School for the Environment here at NTU. Her research aims to illuminate the relationships between people and nature to promote nature-based solutions in urban planning decisions. She studies various services provided by natural infrastructure in urban and rural environments, with a particular interest in hydrologic services. Pareen has extensive experience in urban ecosystem services modeling and has led the development of several open source models that support management decisions. Prior to NTU, she was a senior scientist at the Natural Capital Project at Stanford and founded something called the Co-Risk Labs, which promotes collaborative practices around climate and disaster risk. Her latest projects include an NRF fellowship called Creating Resilient and Inclusive Cities in the Asia Pacific. So I'm sure you'll agree with me that these are both going to be fascinating people to hear from with regards to this topic that we have today about how to respond to climate change. So how we're going to run this is both of the speakers are going to introduce their work and their kind of positions very briefly in about 5 minutes each. I'm going to call on Sunny just in a minute to go first. And then we're going to open it up first with some questions from myself and Vanessa, and then open it up more widely to audience participation. So please, already as the speakers are speaking, you can use the Q&A function to post any questions that you might have, and we will ask them verbally to the speakers. So you can begin to do that when you like. One other note is that I want to preface this by saying that we're trying to create a kind of debate here, a kind of fun session in which we can kind of express, and we ask our presenters to express their opinions as forthrightly as possible. So in some cases that may mean they, take a position basically for the purposes of the debate. So it may not always reflect exactly the position that they might take in their scholarly work, for example. So just remain aware of that. They play a kind of devil's advocate potentially in some circumstances. So without further ado, let me hand over to Sunny, who's, I believe, going to share some slides. And I think we'll close the poll at this time.
All right, thank you so much, Vanessa and Hallam, for organizing this. Hallam, thank you for the nice introduction. You make me look better than I could make myself look, so thank you for that. Hopefully, I can live up to everyone's expectations about my domain expertise. I'm going to share my slides right now. So I just created some slides to demonstrate, or at least try to convince you of what I know about this topic. I'd like to start by talking about climate change in the classroom, because this is where I draw on a breadth of knowledge, not just my specific area of expertise, but a wide range of knowledge about climate change, and I teach it to my students. I teach a module called Promoting Sustainability in the Week in We School, and students develop media projects to promote environmentally responsible behaviors in public. And I teach content on sustainability and communications. For example, I teach about the circular economy, how economic circularization can reduce demands on nature. I also explore some more technical topics like the radiation transmission and absorption by the atmosphere as a way to explain one of the main mechanisms of climate change and global warming. So I do have a little bit of technical background knowledge, but I don't research this. This is just stuff that I've read. And I think at some points in this discussion, I'll be expressing a perspective, not drawn directly on my research, but on things I've read and things I teach. And so I might bring up some technical matters. I'm not a technical expert though, so if there's someone in the audience who knows these things better than I do, please jump in and correct me. All right, so here's what I research. I study environmental and science communication broadly. I've done a number of studies focusing quite specifically on climate change, looking at knowledge formation, information seeking, the influence of narratives, public opinion, segmentation of public based on their opinion, and then how public opinion influences support for government spending. I've created one-sentence summaries of these studies. So in the first study, we found that the variety of media sources people use is related to their knowledge about global warming. In another study, we found that knowledge, or I should say perceived deficit of knowledge, predicts information seeking about climate change. Very recently, I did a study looking at how media messages can influence public opinion, and when climate change denying messages are embedded in narratives, it can lead public toward accepting those messages. And so these studies are about media use and media effects. And then the other three studies look more at public opinion, so how context and experience influence beliefs. In one of the early studies on this, we found that although more than 90% of Singaporeans agree climate change is happening, they were roughly split between it being human-caused versus a natural phenomenon. We've conducted segmentation studies looking at different opinion factions, how the public can be separated into homogeneous subgroups based on what they believe about climate change. And then I've done some research looking at how people's opinion toward things like geoengineering influences their support for government spending on geoengineering. I'm going to talk briefly about this one study. I did this with colleagues in the We Kim We School. I believe at least Ben Dettenber is watching this right now. So hello, Ben, thanks for joining. We conducted a segmentation study looking at data from an online survey of over 1,000 Singaporeans. We measured their attitudes, knowledge, and perceptions of climate change. And then we tested a segmentation model based on one that was developed in the United States. In the United States, the public was segmented into these 6 segments: alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. I'm not going to describe these segments. I think they're fairly self-descriptive, but we found that model didn't work very well in the Singapore context because just about everyone in Singapore agrees climate change is happening. We found these 3 segments. So there's the concerned, who believe climate change is happening and it's worrisome. Individuals need to take actions to avert future disaster. There are the disengaged, who also agree climate change is happening, but they aren't really interested in doing anything about it. And then there's the passive, who are like the concerned in that they believe climate change is happening and it's concerning, but rather than them taking individual responsibility, they believe it's the role of institutions, things like scientists and governments, to deal with the issue. And I think this study is especially relevant because it pertains to the topic we'll be discussing today. The concerned and passive segments want to take action. The dismissive segment doesn't think action is necessary. But then the concerned and passive segments differ in who they think is responsible. Is it individuals? Is it groups of consumers? Or is it the government? So this relates to something else I teach. So in contrast to the circular economic model, there's this linear take, make, use, dispose model, which creates all kinds of negative externalities for the environment. I talk about the role of government in creating regulations, taxes, and subsidies to address the negative externalities related to consumption. But I also talk about the role of civil society, so groups of consumers, non-governmental organizations. This is another source of influence. So if consumers and businesses individually aren't going to do what it takes, what is the role of government? What is the role of concerned citizens and non-governmental organizations? So that was my slide deck. That gives you a quick background about what I know, some areas of climate change that I address in my teaching, and then some things that I've specifically researched. And hopefully I've drawn some relevant links to what we'll be discussing today. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Sunny. That's great. Now I'll invite Perrine to share with us an introduction also.
Great. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Vanessa and Sunny, for this first introduction. So I'm going to use my 5 minutes or so to argue that it's definitely not too late. I think that's my side of the debate, and that one action we can take right now is to invest in nature. That's probably one of the safest, not the only way, but one of the safest things to do to address climate change. So I'm going to try and argue that first it makes sense. That's my first point. Second, that working with nature also means working with people. That's my second point. And the third point is that working with nature and investing in nature also means that we need to stop thinking linearly. So I'm going to try and explain that. Let me share a few slides as well, just to keep you entertained. There. Can you guys see my screen correctly? Yes, all right. So starting with the why bother investing in nature, well, from a climate perspective, I think it's important to remember that the biodiversity crisis is also the second major societal and global crisis that we're facing, and that addressing both at the same time really makes sense, both for mitigation and for adaptation. So for mitigation of climate change, so this idea of reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it really makes sense to invest in nature. And it's been shown that 1/3 of the carbon sequestration that we need to meet the Paris Agreement can actually be met by investing in nature, restoration or conservation. So that's an important point to remember. For adaptation, the point is generally more accepted. We talk a lot about climate resilience in the press in cities, and this idea is that we can rely on some of the benefits provided by nature to adapt to flood risk. So nature will help absorb some of the flood waters, for example, or help us address heat waves in cities by providing shade, evaporating water. So all these benefits from nature can definitely help us with climate adaptation. There's some good examples here in Singapore with the ABC Waters program, really relying on what we call nature-based solutions. So for the second point, I like to argue that investing in nature is also investing in people. Oops, one slide too many. And here I'm sharing a provocative and ironic advertisement created in an artathon that I've organized with my colleagues from Co-Risk Labs. which is obviously a way to illustrate that working with people and communication, better understanding the science and the type of actions we can take really matters in addressing this climate crisis. Sonny demonstrated that well, I think, in his work and what he presented earlier. And the point here is that to recognize that it's not us versus nature or us protecting nature, but we are part of nature, and especially when it comes to understanding and addressing climate change, we need to understand how our behaviors and actions might actually impact the system. So that's one point about investing in people, but there's also a second point that's really important to remember, is that we need to promote inclusive climate action. So climate change was not brought about in the same way by everyone on Earth, not if we look at different nations, but also within countries, within cities. So that's important to remember that the responsibilities are not distributed equally. And importantly, the impact of climate change will not affect everyone equally either. Again, whether it's at the city scale or globally, not all people will be affected in the same way, and that's something to remember when we design policy and actions. Moving to my third point, I wanted to remind us all that nature is non-linear, and that can actually play in our favor or against us. So an example of negative non-linearity would be some of the tipping points that some of you may have heard about, with this idea that the system cannot keep absorbing some of the disturbances and incremental changes, and that may cascade and have very large environmental or social impacts. But there are also, I guess, positive non-linearities when we think about how some small investment can actually have disproportionate impacts, positive impacts. So it's been shown that restoring 30% of the ecosystems globally could actually help us reduce the projected extinctions of species by 70%. So that's an example of leverage that we can use thinking of these non-linearities. And just my last point on these non-linearities is about systemic changes with people. Again, this idea that small positive signals that we see around the world in the civil society, in the private sector, that are slowly but surely going to change the system. So we need to encourage these actions. No action is too small, and that's a way for us as a society to kind of change the regime that we are in, if we talk about the system, and change the way we eat, we work, we live, to promote a more climate neutral and nature positive society. So I'll wrap it up here, and I'm happy to discuss more how these solutions might look like in practice globally and in Singapore.
Thanks, Perrine, and thanks to both of you for these introductions. I think that gives us a good basis here. Again, I want to take this opportunity just to remind everyone, please post not only comments, we're also happy to address or try to address any questions or comments that you have, or any feedback you have for us, or follow up on the questions if we're not responding to them. So we're interested in you engaging as much as possible here as well. So please do that. Maybe I'll just kick it off by asking the speakers a kind of question that I think draws their various expertise together in some ways. And this is the question of kind of what do we think is the kind of, the major kind of roadblock here in some ways. In some ways, we have, and particularly not so much in Singapore perhaps, but we have in the United States, we know, for example, a lot of people who don't even believe climate change is a real thing, right? So is this a problem of ignorance? How do we get people to move from Sunny's category of disengaged or passive to concerned. Is that really the main thing that's at stake here? I'm wondering, what do you see as the kind of, for each of you, the critical issue here in terms of moving forward with this? Perhaps Sunny, I'll invite you to go first.
Sure, I'll go first. And I realized after I introduced myself, Hallam, I think you were waiting for me to give my stance. And I'll give my stance really quickly, and then I'll answer your question. I think in many ways it is too late to stop climate change. I think we're generally limited to reducing future climate change or reducing excessively increasing CO2 levels in the atmosphere. I think that's where we are. I don't think we're going to get back to pre-industrial CO2 levels. So it's not about stopping climate change. It's about reducing future climate change. And then we do have to adapt. I think we're set on a path where adaptation will be necessary no matter what. But how do we get there? And that's kind of the crux of what, Hallam, you were just asking about. What are some of the roadblocks? There's this idea in science communication of a deficit model of public understanding of science, where people don't accept science, they don't appreciate science, they aren't going to respond to science or scientific recommendations simply because they don't know enough about science. And there's been a lot of research pushing back against that idea and rejecting it in favor of a more contextual model. And the idea is people believe science when it's relevant to their everyday experience. When I was introducing myself, I talked about how Singaporeans are fairly split on whether climate change is man-made or natural. And I haven't been able to explain why that is the case, but I have an idea. And it's because in the Singapore context, the causes of climate change aren't as important as the effects. Singapore is threatened by rising sea level. Singapore contributes a rather small percent to CO2 emissions. So what is more salient in the context of Singapore? It's not the causes of climate change, it's the effects, and that's where the attention goes. And so what's relevant in discourse in Singapore is how climate change will potentially harm Singapore and what can Singapore do about it. This isn't to say Singapore shouldn't do anything toward climate change mitigation. Singapore has taken steps, or the government has taken steps toward that, but there's a lot of efforts toward adaptation, and perhaps more than any other country in terms of investments in climate change adaptation. So I think one of the limiting factors is just the context, and something that's come out of a lot of research going back into the 90s about public perception of climate change is that a lot of people aren't concerned about it because it's such a gradual process. It lives outside human experience, daily experience. We can't see climate change with our own eyes. We have to depend on what scientists tell us about these very slow and gradual patterns. And there's this general perception that climate change isn't affecting the here and now, but the there and future. And this is again about context. How can people be concerned about something that isn't really affecting them? And I think that's a huge limiting factor. The average citizen isn't concerned enough about climate change to alter their consumption patterns. And I think this also applies to businesses. Businesses are not going to overnight shift their manufacturing processes, their distribution processes over these concerns, which are a little bit abstract, right? And I think governments face the same issue. These are limiting factors. I think government regulations and government taxes are really the way to go for pushing behaviors. But again, how do you get governments to commit to such actions? It's this challenge of abstractness, of psychological distance.
Thanks. Perrine?
Yeah, perhaps I can add a little bit to that. Also relating, I think you talked about a non-linear model in a sense for how people understand science or act based on their knowledge or lack of knowledge of scientific facts. And I think there's a lot of similarities as well with the non-linear science to policy model when we talk to whether it's companies, policies, or government, local or national governments. And I think to go back to your question, Hallam, this idea of like, where do we start and what's the problem? Why can't we actually take action? I feel like the problem being very complex and requiring systemic change is paralyzing for a lot of people. And so I feel like encouraging small actions is one way, whether it's from companies, from individuals, from national governments, is one way to kind of get started. If I can give an example in the space of environmental conservation, where I work, this idea of investing in nature-based solutions is kind of a no-brainer. Everyone loves pandas, and taking a walk in a park, it's not a very controversial issue. And on the science side, we know a lot already about what it can do for people, for cities, for climate. But even in these, in a number of workshops and on the international agenda, I feel like people are not sure about where to start. I was participating a couple of weeks ago in a workshop on science-based targets for nature, led by the Global Common Alliance. And the whole point was to help people get started and help cities get started with this journey. And I feel like there's no shortage of guidance documents on how to take these steps, but it's still for a given city, a given individual who may be the sustainability officer at the city level in a company. It's still a little paralyzing to know that everything is connected, and we're not sure about all the implications of a given action. So yeah, I feel like the things are changing, but encouraging this and not criticizing small actions is also an important part of recognizing that we all need to move forward together, and that there's probably no perfect solution, but that together we can try and address this and take action now.
Great. Helen, shall I take a few from the audience that have come in?
Yeah, sounds great.
So there's one question by Pavel Adamek. Pavel, if you want to tell us a little bit more about your affiliation and stuff, please add it to the Q&A so we can introduce you a little better. So the question is whether the mainstream media, and Pavel mentions the USA and European Union specifically, but I'm guessing his question is not limited to those areas. How have the mainstream media been reporting on climate change in a way that represents either business interests or public interests? What's your opinion on that?
I guess I'll weigh in on this a bit. I'm a media expert, at least in name. So mainstream media, I think it's difficult to identify whether the mainstream media are primarily public interested or interested in not upsetting the advertisers who support their media outlet, and then also well, I guess this goes down to business interests, the interests of the news outlet itself. Sometimes you'll see sensational headlines that misrepresent the issue to draw in readers' attentions, right? So yeah, I think in many ways the mainstream media don't represent these issues perfectly, but in the end, I don't think they're disinterested in public interest. And I think the serious news organizations really do care about public interest. They build their practices on solid principles in ethical journalism. So that's the foundation. And then they have to contend with business interests and making profits. So there is a delicate balance there. But I think in general, the way the mainstream media report about these issues does serve the public. And then we fall back to, what does the public do with that information? How do they react? And where do echo chambers form? So different media outlets have slightly different perspectives on the issue of climate change. Even within the mainstream media, you can see some lean more toward a conservative view that we shouldn't be engaged in draconian measures to restrict business activities that have large CO2 emissions. On the other end of the spectrum, within the mainstream media, there's more of the view that we need to take urgent action now. And both of these can be valid perspectives depending on the context of the audience and the context of the editors. And again, I don't think it's about satisfying specific business needs, but it's about speaking to an audience. And so it's hard to disentangle this. There isn't a mainstream media, it's the mainstream media, which in and of itself contains a diversity of views. And then of course you get to the fringe media where there might be even more interesting views on these issues. But that's a tough question to answer. I believe the mainstream media play an important role in making these issues a part of people's experience. The media are often described as a way of experiencing these environmental issues vicariously. So I think they do play an important role and they can serve public interests.
Great. Perrine, you might want to also reflect on this, like what is mainstream media? I mean, we've now said mainstream media. For a lot of people nowadays, mainstream media is whatever is on Facebook or Twitter. And also, what could be the role of a scientist? So I think, Sunny, you explained really well, look, this is how the influence goes, then it matters what the public does with that. But there's, I don't know, I think every scientist scholar has had this kind of discussion with the media. Is this interesting enough? When are these findings interesting? When are they in the public interest? And some of us are a little bit better at convincing the media than others. So what could be an active role of a scientist in this?
Yeah, I can take that. That's a really important point. I was thinking about the serious news organization that Sonny mentioned, and I guess we all have a different definition of what this might be. But I definitely agree that it's also our responsibility to seek information and get information from sources that we trust. And so that's as a citizen, as a scientist and researcher, I feel like that's also our responsibility to understand where people get their information and make sure that we do some outreach, for lack of a better word, and try and send our messages where we feel like they'll have the biggest impact. There are many ways to do that. Perhaps NISTH is an example of new channels of information for NTU at very different levels. There are some great examples, and I guess we should not shy away from making our voices heard in a society that is definitely overwhelmed by information. There's definitely a lot of noise, and so finding ways to get some clear messages where we feel they'll have an impact is part of my role, at least. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm. So Hallam, I see a question by Ian Dixon that is specifically contextualized around Australia. So I really think you should take this one.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me here that actually a lot of the questions are focusing on these issues of communication, right? And how do we change the message in some ways? And I think this is another one, but perhaps kind of more directed towards changing the role of governments here. I mean, so the specific question is, how do we get governments to change their policies? And the example is taken from Australia here, with Australia resisting the idea that the bushfires earlier in 2020 and late 2019 were a result of climate change, and resisting kind of scientific opinion on this. And I mean, Perrine, perhaps we can begin with you here, because you were mentioning a minute ago this idea of cities. There's lots of information out there about what to do, but you know, what if people just don't do it, right? I mean, what if governments, policymakers just don't? So I guess, yeah, I mean, how do you actually convince people to do this, or policy and government in particular?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I'll start by not addressing, by emphasizing the role of local governments and the private sector, because a lot of the UN and international agreements have focused on national governments. And a lot of people realize that this is not the right scale for a lot of the action. The private sector and local governments, so cities, have actually more leverage to work and have an impact. We've seen that in the US with the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, but then a lot of mayors actually taking some leadership and increasing their work towards climate action. So that's a good example in the US. There are some examples in Australia as well. And that's why these new science-based targets that I was mentioning actually focus on both businesses as well as local governments. Then I guess the question about national government that do have, especially here in Singapore, where some of these layers actually overlap, they do have a role to play. We're back to good outreach and engagement involvement within some of these spheres, which is probably easier to do here in Singapore, as we are a small island nation, and relatively easier to get your voice heard at the national level.
Thanks, and perhaps Sunny, I mean, this is, I mean, I know that your opinion is that it's really now seems to be up to governments to do something about this, but I guess what if governments don't? What if governments are not doing something about it?
So governments are kind of like the mainstream media in that they want to appease their constituents or audiences. They aren't going to deviate too much from what is expected of them in their role. And so the public does play an important role, just as public interests can change over time, and the media may react to that by reporting on issues differently. When public opinion about climate change and how to deal with it shifts, governments will generally respond accordingly, at least in properly running democracies. The government policy will respond to what the public thinks is important, at least to some degree. So the public does play an important role. And this, when I was introducing myself, I talked about the role of civil society. So these are groups of concerned citizens who want to see changes about something they're concerned about that reflect a common set of values. And often we see this civil society in the form of non-governmental organizations. Non-governmental organizations and concerned groups of citizens can put pressure on governments, or at least explain to governments what are issues concerning citizens that need to be addressed with policy measures. So there's an important role that citizens play for creating this type of pressure, or at least demonstrating to the government that certain policy approaches will have traction publicly and will be an appropriate approach to not upset the public. So yeah, there's that aspect. I also want to comment on something Prem was talking about with local governments, and this goes back to my comment about contextualization. So certain policy measures policy measures are best applied in narrow situations. One policy measure can't be a blanket solution to the entire world. And so policies need to be developed locally, but the more local you make these policies and the more local control there is, that creates a greater need for coordination. So this is another limitation of governments. Governments need public support, but then also when we take this more local approach, which I think is the right approach, it becomes more challenging to coordinate efforts when this is, after all, a global issue.
So Sunny, you're saying that as soon as the public gets a strong opinion, then most of the times governments will respond. But it also sometimes comes across as not that way at all, right? I mean, young generations have been angry for so long and no one's ever listened. And there's a huge lobby from all sorts of industries and all sorts of diplomatic reasons, international power reasons why X, Y, Z is not possible. And I mean, we're all talking super calmly about this now, but there's a lot of anger out there. There are a whole lot of kids who are just, losing it because we're all doing nothing. And you mentioned democratic countries, if they're properly run, they should respond. But a lot of democratic countries, are there for, the government's there for 4 years. It's not really in their horizon. Also, they might be chosen because of more populist issues rather than these issues. What about this tension between the anger of the people and the seemingly complacency of the government responses?
Yeah, so what I'm talking about is kind of an ideal, and I'm really talking about what are some sources of pressure to create change. I go back to my idea that it is too late, and I don't think humanity is going to do what is necessary all of humanity. You see isolated instances where there is positive change in the direction we need to go, but I think collectively we aren't going to take the change that is needed until we're dealing with these drastic effects of climate change. And really that's going to be what creates change. I think any proactive preventive measures are not going to gain enough traction to sway individual governments and to lead to the global coordination that's necessary. So I'm talking about ideals, but in reality, I'm quite pessimistic about what humans are able to do. I don't think humans are going to go extinct, but I think we're going to face some serious challenges in the future that we're only going to address in retrospect. We're very reactive, and I don't study this aspect of human psychology, but I think it's pretty well established. Humans tend to be more reactive than proactive, and often we don't do what is needed until we see the harms of not having acted in the first place. So I didn't really answer your question, but I think I qualified my previous statement.
Yeah, and this also leads to a question by Praman Rajalingam. Pareen, maybe you can pull that into your response, where people may just not know what to do. I mean, even if people are totally convinced about climate change, totally convinced about that it needs to be countered, there are fractions that feel very differently about how radical the solutions should be and what the roles are of the different parts of the publication. And the question by Praman Rajalingam is, could it be that also people don't quite know what to do because it's kind of unclear what to do? Yeah? Scientists have to communicate their findings with a degree of uncertainty. Do people understand that? Do they understand us when we try and inform the public?
Yeah, really, really good point. I guess I'll make 2 points. First, how do we start taking action? The low-hanging fruits are probably the so-called win-win solutions. If it benefits people and helps with climate action, why not starting there? An example that I've worked on quite extensively is called water funds, or payment for ecosystem services program. So the idea is for the private sector or local governments to put some money in a fund that is then used to, for example, restore or protect nature in the upper part of a watershed. And this means that we'll have more water and higher quality water downstream. So it's kind of a win-win. We protect nature, we incentivize farmers or invest in community projects upstream. And this has a direct benefit for the private sector or for water or hydroelectric plants downstream. So these are some of these win-win projects that the field of conservation, environmental conservation, is really trying to leverage, and as well in the field of finance, where a lot of these climate bonds are trying to, or impact investment are trying to promote these kind of projects. So there are a lot, to answer Praman's question as well, there are a lot of very concrete actions. This financial mechanism that I just described, the water fund, is one of them. But there's a series of these nature-based solutions that are now very established and that can really be implemented in many cities or many countries. The other part of the question is where there's more uncertainty or where people themselves are not convinced that this is the right thing to do. This, to me, goes back to the more fundamental question about the socio-ecological system that we all live in, which is our little planet, and really trying to change the way we relate to nature. So it's more about these cultural changes that can be achieved through education. That's definitely one thing. We had in a higher education organization here, and that's part of our mission at the Asian School of the Environment, to educate the future generation, but also with, I guess, more different ways that people can reconnect with nature. We're talking a lot about this in the context of COVID as well, with a lot of the citizens around the world being confined at home and realizing the importance of even local nature. And so this really helps reconnect and remember that we are part of nature, and that, again, protecting nature is also protecting ourselves. So these changes are, I see some positive signals. Obviously, that's what I do every day, so I'm biased here, but I'm feeling that these the youth voices that you were alluding to, Vanessa, earlier, are more and more heard around the world. So this makes me optimistic.
Thanks. Yeah, Simon Redfern also refers to this idea of generations, how important generational differences are. You know, all the kids marching every Friday in support of Extinction Rebellion, all these mass movements, how important generations are. My own feeling is that, you know, when I was a teenager in the Netherlands, I tied myself up to the gates of the, how do you call it, the rockets that were pointed towards Russia in the Cold War. And, you know, we really felt, okay, this can't happen. There's no way there's going to be a nuclear war, and we're going to stop it. And then at some point, there's the problem with generational differences. You switch generations, and then all your priorities start to change. So obviously this generational model somehow, I don't know, it doesn't seem to work. Are we doing it wrong? Should we make all our kids prime ministers? I mean, what is the solution? How can we, I don't know,
I'd like to address this. This is a point that comes up a lot in public opinion research, is this idea of effects of age or effects of cohort. So what you're seeing over time is, at least in recent decades, in many countries, mindsets are becoming increasingly liberal. And so if you look at people who are 50 years old today, they're more liberal than people who are 50 years old a decade ago, who are more liberal than 50-year-olds a decade before. So those are cohort effects. And then what you're talking about now, Vanessa, are age effects. I think there's also this demonstrated effect where when we're younger, we're more idealistic and more engaged in pursuing the change that we think is needed. And then as we age, we become less interested in these issues, or at least less invested in them, less willing to put our time and effort into it. And with many issues, these are competing effects. As people get older, they get less liberal, but then as society gets older, it gets more liberal, and you have to disentangle these. I haven't actually looked into these effects in the context of public opinion about climate change. You're making me think I need to start doing this, but this is a demonstrated effect in many other areas of public opinion research. And I think disentangling that can help understand, is society aging in a direction toward greater environmental protection, or are we just seeing that young people are always more interested in these things, and we're imagining a brighter future that might not come to fruition?
Thanks, Sunny. I wanted to pick up on one thing that I think came up in an answer to an answer Perrine gave, and this was this question of kind of the role of business here. And you know, potentially, again, this is a question, I'm building on a question from Andy Prahl, who's one of Sunny's colleagues at We Can We, and he says, well, maybe scientists can't do anything to stop this. Should we stop trying to speak to the general public and to political leaders and instead focus our efforts on getting private industry to change? And I guess, you know, Perrine, you were giving some examples of ways in which we could intervene, or where the private industry could intervene. And, you know, is this your opinion that actually, that we should focus our efforts on using leveraging the kind of role of private industry here? Is this the kind of the right approach?
Definitely, and for several reasons. First, the businesses are not an abstract entity; they are people. So if we actually act at our individual level, we may bring these values into our companies, and vice versa. The second reason is that there's more and more realization of obviously the impact that they have on, through advertising, through the supply chain, like the way we eat, live, and do everything on this planet. So small changes, talking about non-linearity, small changes can have a huge impact. So when a company like Unilever, consumer good companies, which is well known for their progressive engagement and climate and biodiversity action, announces that they're going to put $1 billion in a climate and nature fund. Some call it greenwashing. I think that's a positive signal that we should definitely use and try and work with them to achieve and make the most of this funding. There's currently, I think, 3% of the green finance funding that goes into nature protection. So that's again something that we can all work towards to make sure that we leverage these win-wins that I was talking about. And again, I guess giving some concrete examples of some of this action being happening around the world. There's a new union called the Ecological Spring in France that is a union for the private sector that's only about putting pressure and making the ecological voices heard within companies. It's gaining quite a lot of attention, and I feel like this might be some good ways to not have a passive attitude towards the big companies that control everything, but really all of us who work in these companies or buy from these companies can try and move the needle in terms of the climate and nature goals.
Sunny, I'll invite you to respond to that's this question too, and I know you'll probably have a view on this as well. But I just wanted to also mention a couple of comments here in the chat from Chesian Ng and Hanyao Yong Liao as well, about these really focusing on just emphasizing this view that in fact I think that their view is really that we can, that this has been something that's only been recognized, the effects of climate change are only something that have been recognized recently, and that in fact, we are making a difference, and therefore it's not too late to make a change here. So I think, yeah, it's important, I guess, to just kind of think about the kind of this in terms of the recency in which we recognize this as well. I think that's an important kind of contribution.
So I'll address the previous question, and then also the comment from Chesiang Ng about our industries and businesses doing enough, and is our governments taking appropriate actions, and in some ways they are. There's fairly recently the Resources Sustainability Act in Singapore, 2019, and as part of that act, a lot of initiatives have been rolled out to encourage environmentally responsible behaviors, extended producer responsibility, electronics take-back programs. And so this is one example in the Singapore context of government policies putting pressure on businesses to reduce their ecological footprint and to provide mechanisms for consumers to be more environmentally friendly. And that's one example. And I think Singapore is a prime place to develop such policies, because the government, for the most part, can just do it, and there aren't going to be these opinion factions that are pushing back and making a bunch of fuss about it. So this well-intentioned policy can be implemented, and hopefully down the road it does create the intended changes. So that's one side of the coin, and I think there are definitely some positive movements in that direction. In isolated instances, of course, we still need this global cooperation to make this a global solution. And then on the flip side of what businesses can do, there's also increasing adoption of corporate social responsibility. You look at sustainability reports that companies put out, and admittedly, a lot of it's probably greenwashing. They're calling established practices green because there's something ecologically friendly about it. Using less paper is environmentally friendly, but they do it really because it saves them money. But there is a lot of shift toward corporate social responsibility, and businesses do change some of their practices, either out of genuine concern or because they need to fill in some additional lines in their sustainability report. So there are definitely shifts that are from top down, governments creating pressure, and then from bottom up, satisfying consumer demand for more sustainable businesses, and businesses are creating change. Is that change enough to not just stop where we are? If we stop emitting CO2 now, there's still going to be climate change in the future. The CO2 emitted today doesn't lead to temperature increases today. There are delayed effect. It's called climate lag, right? So it's not about stopping emissions today. If we want to stop climate change, we have to reverse emissions. And I'm not sure we have what it takes to create that level of change. But anyone, feel free to disagree.
Thanks, Sunny. So we're just really at the coming to the end here, and thank you again for this great discussion. But I wanted to perhaps we can open the poll, which is the same question that we had at the beginning, and our idea is to see if people's opinions have shifted here. But also, I just want to invite the participants to wrap up and give any kind of closing thoughts that they have. Especially I want to do that kind of around this very last question that came up, which was about what do they think we can do here at NTU as a community, sort of locally? How can we act locally in this case to address some of the questions? So perhaps Perrine, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, big question. Perhaps I'll use this opportunity to contextualize my answer to distinguish between three types of values, because I think Sonny said this you're using different words, but these are very important when you talk about taking action. What do you value? What motivates you to act? And in the work of socio-ecological systems that I'm doing, we distinguish between the intrinsic values of nature, like nature has a role to exist, and we need to protect this irrespective of us being here on this planet or not. The more instrumental values, which are some of the services that I was mentioning. And finally, the relational values, which is what our relation to nature, how we think it's important because of a sense of place, places that perhaps we used to go as a child that may be affected by climate change. And so I think this is a useful framework to think about why we may actually take action, and that can be applied to the NTU campus as well. So perhaps as an example of reconnecting with nature, encouraging people to spend more time in our beautiful Union Garden, which is obviously man-made, but also part of nature. There are some community gardens on campus as well. And then thinking about some of these intrinsic values of nature, reducing our impact through actions like thinking twice when we need to travel in a time when we can travel, and other actions that are similar to those that the businesses or individuals can take.
Okay, Sunny, that gives you exactly 2 seconds to end your statement. No, I'm joking.
Eco-campus solar panels.
And lots of taxes.
Sorry.
It's fine.
I mean, that's I think if we look at what NTU's done to reduce its carbon footprint, maybe it's putting up all the solar panels everywhere. That's probably a good thing. You have to do the whole life cycle assessment, but it's probably reducing NTU's carbon footprint, long-term carbon footprint. So that's one of the big things, and all the other projects that came out of and continue to come out of EcoCampus and the Energy Research Institute.
Great. Helen, do you want to do the closing poll?
Sure. So seems like we haven't shifted people's opinion that much. I believe we've gone from, it's good to see people are optimistic. So about 70% of those of you in the audience disagreed with the proposition here. So they do not think that it's too late. And we've seemed to have made people slightly more pessimistic here, and it's shifted to 65%. But most people remain optimistic about the fact that it's not in fact too late to address climate change. So I hope that in fact the views of both of our debaters here have been enlightening for understanding this question.
Pessimistic makes prepared, Helen. So that brings us to the end of this Think Out debate. So many thanks to Perrine Hamel, our environmental engineer of sustainable and inclusive cities, and Sunny Rosenthal, expert of environmental and science communication. Our very famous Think Out debate water bottle, the huge collector item, is coming your way. Audience, thank you so much for your participation. Please follow us on internet, Facebook, Twitter to learn more about this debate series and access the relevant research papers and information on both of today's speakers. You can join us for the next debate on the 21st of January, 2021 on the medical technology. It's with Joseph Carr, who is a medical doctor by training and an expert in digital transformation of health and healthcare, and May O. Lewin, who is an expert in health and strategic communication with a research interest in interactive digital media and health communication. So thank you so much. Thank you to both our fellows today for this wonderful debate, and we hope to see you all again in our next debate.